Good day, guys. We're just about to start. It's just turned 5:30. For those that obviously all know, we are going to be doing a little kind of pre-US election. Oh, you guys already look in the polls, going pretty fast. A lot of Republicans in this particular, webinar, it seems. Yeah, so we are going to be doing a poll for this thing, obviously, just to see what people think is going to be the outcome for the election. And at the end of it, I'll just publish the results here. So let's just start off. As usual, you guys know who, sorry, a second. I like to start off with a bit of a quote. And the quote this time is from one of the big guys, Abraham Lincoln, and it's "Battles are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets." And normally this is, hyperbolic in discussions with people about, unrest and blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately, I think there is a non-zero chance. I'm not talking there's like a 10%, but maybe there's a 1 or 2% chance that come January, there may be two people claiming to be the president of the United States, as sort of like a peaceful concession from one side or the other. This is a very uncertain period in the US, and we should not be underestimating the danger that could come about if there is a dispute. I mean, the example I would give to you guys is back in 2000, where there was a election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. I mean, that's 24 years ago. Anyone that remembers it well, you're all like me. For those that don't, you can go back and Google the stuff. And it came down to some votes in Florida. And the way that thing worked, there was these ballot cards, and there were these chads that basically you had to punch out. And some of them weren't fully taken out, and therefore they were hanging. Imagine you punch at the hole and you don't punch it all the way through, but there's like a hanging kind of like divot out there. And this was called the hanging chads. And if you go back and Google hanging chad, you'll get lots of information about these things. And eventually it had to go to the Supreme Court of the US, who ruled that effectively that George W. Bush was the president. Now imagine this similar scenario comes down to a few hundred votes between Harris and Trump in Pennsylvania. And then it goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules for Trump. I have no doubt that Harris will not be anywhere near as understanding as Gore was. Gore basically came out after this was done, says, nope, this is the president. Here's my 100% support. I concede entirely and I carry on. That will not be the case this time. Either way, okay? So let's just start off by looking at what the current map looks like between the Republicans and the Democrats in the US presidential election, because this is the one that's getting all the kind of, how can I say, the publicity, okay? I see Harris is catching up, so it's closer than it was at the start, but yeah. This might actually be how the election looks like, by the way. So you can see that most of the states are either firmly red or firmly blue, okay? So the Republicans have 122 guaranteed votes. The Democrats have 191 guaranteed votes. There's no way that these guys are not going to get those votes, okay? Because these states are dramatically in favor of one candidate or the other. That's why, for instance, you don't even have most Republicans going and campaigning in New York, except for Trump, which I'll talk about in a bit, and was an absolute own goal of note. It really comes down to these gray states: Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. These are the states that basically, and Arizona as well, down the bottom. These are the states that are going to decide the election. You win these states, you won. You don't win these states, you're not going to win, okay? You win a certain number of these states. So, for instance, you can see that the difference between the Democrats and Republicans at the safe level is quite large. But if you add in likely places, like Texas is very likely to go a Republican. Not quite as guaranteed as California is to go Democrat, but it's not worth playing for, okay? Florida is very likely to go Republican as well. you add in all the Republican very likelies, you add in all the Democrat very likelies, you get into 219 versus 226. You have to get to 270. You get to 50 votes out of those 93 votes in these kind of states in contention, the Pennsylvanias and so on. Now, at the moment, it does appear that the ones at the bottom, Trump has, and the ones at the top, they're called the blue wall states, like, Wisconsin and like Michigan and Pennsylvania, are supposed to be Harris's, blue wall. Nevada apparently is leading towards Harris, and I'll talk about it in a second, and how this is not maybe the correct way to look at things. But it comes down to these particular states, these particular, important states out there. And so all the advertising and all the efforts are going to these particular states. And we'll talk about just what it looks like at the moment for the presidential election. So let's just look at the agenda for this particular seminar. We'll talk about the presidency, then the Congress, the Senate, the economic impact, and what stocks to buy, or rather what things to invest with, because there's a couple of things in there that's not stocks this time around. So the presidency. The presidency is going to be, okay, here we are. Back to this particular thing. Okay, like I said, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. That's where this election is going to be decided on. Okay, you win the majority of these things, you're going to win the election. Okay. Now, according to the polls at the moment, it's a coin toss. Now, I don't know how much we can trust the polls. Let me explain to you why. It's pretty clear that the US media or journalistic landscape is broken. They do not publish articles in a fair manner. There is a definite bias. New York Times pro-Harris, it's called Fox News pro-Trump. There is a very clear, bias in the coverage out there. And if you look at the polls that are coming out, the polls there's too many of them that are just basically 1% apart. Okay, either tied or 1% apart. The chances of those 7 states being tied or 1% apart, or is quite low. So the assumption I would make out there is that pollsters are covering their butts. Okay, they are trying to basically go towards the center, and they don't want to give any kind of like strong indication one way or the other of who is likely to win. So we have to basically try and figure out from other aspects than just the polls, who's the likely winner of that election. So let's look at not just the absolute numbers, but look at the trend. Where's the momentum? Right now, the momentum is towards Trump. How do you know that? Because the polls that used to say Harris was 3% ahead are now saying Harris is 2 to 1% ahead. Okay, the polls that said she was 1% ahead are now saying Trump is tied with her. Okay, so if you look at all these polls over the last, say, month or so, they all have decreased or most of them have decreased for Harris by about 1 or 2%. So even though some of the polls are still saying she is winning, remember that the previous month, they had her winning by more. So momentum right now is in favor of Trump. And the reason for this is quite simple. The less events that happen, the more the election seems to be drifting towards a slight Trump hedge. And in fact, any big event tends to work against Trump. This is the weekend, for example, for some reason, or maybe because he's from New York, Trump held a rally at Madison Square Gardens. It's a big arena in the US, okay? And a comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, came out and did a racist joke about Puerto Rico, saying there's a island of garbage floating in the middle of the ocean. It's called Puerto Rico, okay? To paraphrase it. And this was if you don't know who Tony Hinchcliffe is, there's a thing called the Tom Brady roast, and you can go and watch that. And I won't even repeat the jokes here because I'm not a comedian and I will be canceled. And, I might even get in front of the court system in South Africa, considering our laws, for some of the stuff he said there. Extremely offensive, but he's what's called a roast comedian. He does offensive jokes. But one of the jokes, like I said, he did was against Puerto Rico. And what then happened was you found a number of Puerto Ricans, including somebody called Bad Bunny. If you don't know who he is, he's a very big Puerto Rican, musician. Ricky Martin, another Puerto Rican musician. Jennifer Lopez, as well from Puerto Rico, have come out and said they're now endorsing Harris because Puerto Rico was insulted. So there is a possibility that this is going to affect them because Puerto Ricans are not a huge number of people in the US, but in some of these states, they have a large enough population to make a difference. So that might be something that's going to affect the voting, okay? But if you exclude this once-off event, and in fact, it may have been canceled by the fact that the next day Biden has came out and pretty much said the same thing about garbage, about Trump supporters, and maybe that cancels out. But barring that, where there's no big news events happening, the race is drifting towards Trump, okay? The next thing, early voting. We're seeing early voting happening across the US. And in some of these states that have early voting, they have a record of what you're registered of, or what party you're registered in when you vote. Don't say that you're going to vote for that party, but it's like saying, I'm a DA member and I'm voting. It doesn't say you're going to vote for the DA. You might vote for the ANC, but you have it on the thing, this guy's registered as a DA member. Likewise, there's people that are registered as Republicans that are voting, people are registered as Democrats that are voting, and people that are registered as independent that are voting. In the early voting numbers, it is extremely clear that the Republicans are voting at a far higher rate than they have voted in the past for the early election. So the momentum shifting towards Trump. In early voting, more Republicans voting than they were in the past for the early vote. The question here comes is, are these people basically new voters, or are the people that were going to vote anyway, and now they're just voting early? In all likelihood, the majority of them were going to be voting anyway for Trump, just voting early. But one important thing about early voting is that it tells you where you need to focus your attention or not. If you have locked down enough early voting in a certain area to win, no matter what, you don't put any money into that, and you focus your efforts on areas where you need to focus on. So that early voting stuff, again, pro-Trump. The garbage gaffe, like we talked about right now, like I said, Trump's comedian made a gaffe, then Biden made a gaffe thereafter. For those that are conspiratorially minded, there is a belief out there that Joe Biden is trying to basically sabotage Kamala Harris. You saw, for instance, in one of her big speeches, he does a press conference just as she does a big speech, kind of taking away the news cycle from her. Just after Trump does this gaffe, or not Trump, but Trump's comedian does this gaffe, Biden comes out and does an almost exact same gaffe around garbage, or using the term garbage for Trump supporters. Kind of, again, taking away the advantage that Harris has. Maybe he's just been very unlucky. Maybe he is trying to sabotage this race. But the one thing I want to focus on is this. In 2016 and 2020, okay, versus 2018 and 2022, let's just look at what the history of polling mistakes have been. In 2016, the polls, some of the polls had a 90+% chance that Clinton was going to win, okay? The strongest poll that had Trump win had him at a 1/3 chance of winning. And that kind of made the name of a guy called Nate Silver, because he was the highest rated pollster for Trump. And even he had a small chance of Trump winning, and Trump dramatically outperformed. In 2020, a similar thing happened. Biden had an 8% lead in the polls. And in the end, he won by less than 1% against Trump, or about 1% against Trump. In fact, the election in 2020 came down to less than about 30,000 votes. If those 30,000 votes had voted for Trump instead of Biden, we'd have President Trump. Okay, even though the electoral college may have been one way or the other, the actual race was significantly closer than had been discussed. Now, many pollsters come out and say, yeah, we got 2016 wrong, we got 2020 wrong, but guess what? We got 2022, which was the last election for what's called a midterm election, very right. So maybe we fixed our errors. But here's what I would say to you. They also got 2018 right. What's the pattern? 2016 wrong, 2020 wrong, 2018 right, 2022 right. The difference is in 2016 and 2020, Trump was on the ballot. 2018, 2022, Trump was not. It appears that when Trump is not on the ballot, the polls are very reliable. When Trump is on the ballot, the polls are not. That is the kind of pattern I'm seeing at the moment. So if we have even a half of the error that we had in 2016 or 2020 in this particular election in the pollsters, Trump's winning by a landslide. Okay? We would have to assume that they fixed entirely the errors of 2016, 2020 for those polls to be believed that this is a coin toss. But if they have not, if like it's even half, in fact, even seeming like a quarter of the error that we saw in 2016 or 2020 in terms of the bias against Trump, he's probably going to win this quite easily. And so therefore, if you had to ask me who's going into this particular thing, and I'm going to, mess with you guys' polling here. I think 34 of you have already voted, and it's about half of you guys have voted. You can, the rest of you guys just click on the poll and put your vote down if you want to. You guys are pretty much, 47% Harris, 53% for Trump. And I think Trump has the edge. If I had to bet, I would bet hedge. If it was even money, say 50-50, double or nothing of your money, who would you vote for? What would you bet on? I'd say I'd bet on Trump. Okay. Because I think the momentum is in his favor. I think the historical bias against him in the polls is in his favor. And I think the early voting seems to be going in his favor as well. And I do think that some of the percentages we are getting in the polls being as close as they are is highly suspicious and makes me believe that some of these pollsters are basically kind of going towards the center because they don't want to be caught out to be wrong. Now, how about the Senate? Now, the way the Senate works in the US is not in the Senate, you don't get a vote in every election. You have a kind of like a staggered thing where some senators basically are not up for re-election at every election, okay? So in this particular example here, you can see that for the Republicans, 38 of their senators are not up for re-election. That means there's 38 people who are going to be Republican in the Senate no matter what. Everybody that votes for a Democrat right now, there will still be 38 Republicans in there. And for the Democrats, the number is 28, okay? So the map favors the Republicans. The map favors, the map favors the Republicans because they already have 38 seats locked up, but the Democrats only have 28 seats locked up, okay? Next, in seats that you would say are pretty safe, you have 9 Republicans and you have 14 Democrats, pretty much guaranteed to get their things, okay? So, add those together, you can 42 guaranteed of pretty safe Democrat seats, and you're getting 47 Republicans. Now, that means of the contested elections out there, you're going to need the Democrats to win a hell of a lot, right? They've got to get from 42 to 50, whereas Republicans are going to get from 47 to 50. Democrats are going to win 8, Republicans are going to win 3. That is a map that favors the Republicans, okay? In fact, by most pollsters out there, the Republicans have like a 90% chance of controlling the Senate after the election. And here is the one little caveat. The way the system works in the US is 100 senators, 50-50. What happens if it's exactly the same? There is a deciding vote, and that deciding vote is by the vice president. And so, if Trump wins, and it's 50-50, then basically it's going to be Trump or Republicans that control the Senate. If Harris wins, and it's 50-50, it'll be the Democrats that control the Senate. Now, why this is important? You must understand how this US system works. The US system works by having 3 pieces of the government. They have the Congress, that kind of makes the vote. Then it goes to the Senate, which kind of does some stuff. When it goes to the president, kind of signs it off. The president doesn't make the laws. Okay, he has some executive orders that he can use, and they can be very powerful. But it comes down to, usually when there's a big law to be done, goes to the Congress, goes to the Senate, comes to him. The other thing the Senate is very important for is what's called confirmations. You want to get a new Supreme Court justice on board. They have to be confirmed by the Senate. You want to get certain appointments done, the Senate has to confirm it. And the way the US has been going in the last couple of years is that they are playing dirty tricks. So one of the reasons that Republicans have such a big majority in the Supreme Court is because when Obama was president and he had a replacement to put in, the Republicans delayed confirmation until Trump won. And therefore, Trump got to put in a person on the Supreme Court that technically should have been Obama's. Okay? So if you do have a situation in which, say, you have the Republicans winning the presidency and the Democrats winning the Senate, and then you have one of the justices in the Supreme Court dying, and that's not a kind of a morbid thing to say. Some of these guys are old. Alito is old. Thomas is old. And if you have those guys dying, and it's maybe a year to go before the next election, well, then I would suspect that the Democrats won't confirm anybody. They'd wait and try and throw the dice for the next election to see if their guy can come into play and then appoint the new Supreme Court justice. So the Senate is very important. But like I said, of all the races going up this time around, it's probably going to be a Republican victory. Much more certain of this than you have of the other races. The one interesting thing is to look at Texas. Ted Cruz, who is the senator from Texas, a Republican, or one of the senators from Texas, Republican, is facing quite a tough race. He's quite disliked. He's made a number of gaffes. For instance, he went on holiday while his state had a big, natural disaster. He's like a character that's the Democrats like to demonize. So he's basically polling just ahead of his challenger. And interestingly, he's polling significantly behind Trump. So Trump is winning Texas quite, nicely, whereas Cruz is not anywhere near as strong in his bid for re-election, though he is, like I said, ahead. Next, here's the Congress. Now, the Congress is far larger body, elections all the time, okay? And so everybody's up for re-election. Now, if you look at this map, and you say, oh, this looks all red, but understand that, it's about population here. So if you look back here, when it comes to the Senate is not about population. Senate is about states. Every state gets 2 senators, okay? The presidency is partly about population. So the bigger states have more electoral votes. California at 54 versus, for instance, Wyoming with 3, okay? But when it comes to senators, California gets 2 and Wyoming gets 2. When it comes to the Congress, no, it's more individual districts, okay? And those districts matter a lot more based on the population, okay? So you can look at some of these states up here. There's one big red block, okay? Look at on some of the states like California, lots and lots of tiny blocks. New York, lots and lots of tiny blocks. Texas, lots and lots of tiny blocks. The popular states here have a lot more votes, okay, than the less popular states. So the way it works is Congress, according to population, Senate, according to each state having 2, Presidency, again, back to population. Though it's not exact, and so there's a little kind of trend, for instance, in the presidency where it's according to population, but the Republicans tend to have an advantage in that let's just say the population is split 50-50, the Republicans are always going to win because it's kind of tilted in their favor. If it's for the Democrats to win consistently, they have to win by like 2%. They win by 1%, they're usually going to lose. I must say, however, that could be changing for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the US is going through a significant realignment in terms of who votes for who. What do I mean by that? So the US, every, say, several decades, has the parties kind of go through a realignment. That means, for some reason or another, the people that used to always support them are no longer the people that always support them, and they get a new kind of constituency together. The example I'll give to you is, for instance, African-American voters in the US. Like before the 60s, it was almost a guarantee that an African-American voter was going to vote for the Republicans. Why? Because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Okay? Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans basically ended slavery. And therefore, if you're African-American, you are voting Republican. Right now, that's not the case. And hasn't been the case for the last, say, 50, 60 years. Why? Because there was a realignment that happened. And suddenly, the South, which used to be very democratic, okay, very in favor of the Democrats, and very anti-Republican, suddenly became massively Republican, okay? And African Americans used to be massively Republican, suddenly became massively Democratic. And that switch around is like realignment that happened. And like I said, this happens, like I say, every like several decades or so. And so we are due for another realignment. And what's the realignment that's happening right now? The realignment that's happening right now is as follows. White voters are going more Democratic. Black voters and Hispanic voters are going less Democratic. Women are going far more for the Democrats than they were in the past. Men are more Republican. But the most important feature here is that it's according to incomes. It used to be wealthy people voted Republican, poor people voted Democratic. Now that's switching around. The poorest people still vote Democratic, but the working class is going Republican. The wealthiest people with college degrees, universally almost going Democratic. Okay? So what we are seeing is a realignment that used to be based on, for instance, things like race, that's being based a bit more on things like class. Blue collar is Republican, white collar is Democrat. Where it used to be white Republican, black Democrat, which is probably a good thing, that you are more based on class than based on, just on a immutable characteristic like race. Okay? And why is that important? Because if you do have a realignment occurring, then it's quite possible that the electoral advantage Republicans had in the past does not exist anymore. And in fact, if you have to go back to 2004, Kerry versus Bush, Kerry came very close to winning that election, even though he was losing the popular vote by quite a bit. It was quite conceivable that John Kerry could have won that election despite losing the popular vote. That just shows that the electoral map used to be in favor of the Democrats versus the Republicans. And because we're having a big shift right now, it's quite possible that Kamala Harris will win the election and lose the popular vote. Like I said, she's just barely ahead or even sometimes tied, even sometimes slightly behind Trump on the national votes. But she is in many cases also doing a little bit better in some of these battleground states. And it's conceivable she wins like with some of the battleground states and lose the others badly. She wins the overall election, but she would have lost the popular vote. Okay? Now, a coin flip again for the Congress, but a slight lean towards the Republicans. But again, very slightly lean towards Republicans. We are talking like 52 to 48% into some measurements here. The next thing is that, look up here, look how few of these things are for grabs. It's 23 of these particular 412 votes are up for grabs. Okay, we're talking less than 5%. Okay, of the votes here, or just about 5% of the votes of the seats are up for grab. Okay, 23 out of 412. Okay, so looking at this particularly, sorry, yeah. So looking at this particular thing here, what I would say to you is we are going to be seeing a lot of uncertainty about who is going to win the Congress. Maybe as much as we are likely to see uncertainty about who's win the presidency, maybe even a little bit more on election night. And the next thing is this. The way the Congress basically usually goes is that if, let's just say, Trump is having a great night, he's not going to switch all of those undecided to Trump or to Republicans, but he will switch some of them over. It's very rare that you can find somebody voting for Trump and then voting for the Democrat, other parts of the ballot. So if Trump is doing well and is being undercounted, it's quite possible that he actually has a positive effect on votes for the Congress. And like I said, because this stuff is reasonably close, if we were correct about Trump winning, he's probably going to get the Congress as well. So what does that mean? A Trump win comes probably with the almost Senate and quite possibly with the Congress. A Democrat win does not come with the Senate and possibly with the Congress. The Republicans win, they will get the Senate. Quite likely they'll also get the Congress. Democrats win will get this presidency, they'll get the Congress, but quite likely they won't get the Senate. So the Republicans have the possibility of having a clean sweep, controlling all three houses here. They control the presidency, they control the Senate, they control the Congress. And this will last for 2 years, this particular advantage. Because then we have the midterm elections, at which point some Republican senators will be up for re-election, all the congressmen will be up for re-election again, and then things will change. But we could have 2 years of a Trump presidency where he has a lot of power. And so just be aware that it's not just about who's president, it's about who's president as well as who is controlling the houses as well. Okay. By the way, you guys can ask questions at any point in time. There's the chat here, there's a question thing. Just click on them, ask a question if you have any questions so far. Okay, if there's none, I'll proceed. So yeah, so what is important about that is that Republicans control everything. What difference does it make in your life? Why is this election so important? Well, let's just look at it. Firstly, I want to say that the rhetoric about why this is so important is probably not why it's so important. Trump, for all his weaknesses and all his issues, is not Hitler. Harris is not Mao or Stalin. Okay. Trump's a 78, 79-year-old man. He'll be in his early 80s by the time he's out of power if he wins. You're not going to have an 80-something-year-old trying to overturn the government. He's old. He's not going to be, maybe it was 40-year-old, you might be thinking a reason like that there. But 80-year-old, no. He's not going to be as that kind of threat to democracy. And Harris is not Mao. She's not going to put people in camps. She's not going to be Stalin and have basically people put to the gulag or whatever. That being said, there are significant policy issues that go beyond culture war issues. And culture war issues are a big play in the US. And this is what may be different about this election than previous elections. In every election that you see with the Republicans and Democrats, there's always been some issue that's important. Abortion, gay rights, trans rights, back in the day, segregation and so on. Those are the issues they often talk about. But when it comes to economic policy, you usually found much more cohesion between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Democrats, compared to any European country, would be a right-wing party in any European country. except for the US, where they're the left-wing party. The Republicans are right-wing everywhere, of course, in Europe. But their policies are pretty similar, with small differences between them in terms of, for instance, taxation levels. Maybe one might be 1 or 2% higher, 1 or 2% lower. But generally, the economic policies of like a Bill Clinton were not that different from George W. Bush. Obama was not different from um, George W. Bush as well. Biden and Trump's economic policies were not that far apart. But this time around, Eba, a lot more is in play. Firstly, trade. Trump has said numerous times, I don't even watch any of his speeches, that tariffs are one of the most beautiful words in the world. He loves the word tariff. Why? Because he believes that tariffs are the way the US can actually fight China and some of its competitors overseas who are taking advantage of the US. So Trump is much, much, much more in favor of tariffs than Harris is. And what would tariffs mean? Like trade wars, trade issues would be significantly affected if the US decides to go on a tariff raising regime. Places like Europe, places like China would probably respond to tariffs from the US. And that would basically be a kind of like a barrier to more global integration in terms of trade, in terms of economies. Harris, on the other hand, would probably not do any of that stuff. So in terms of trade, you'd find a lot of difference between the Harris and Trump regimes. Next, in terms of taxes. Harris is going to raise taxes. Trump is probably going to keep them the same or lower them. Very simple, especially on companies and high-earning individuals. This is a bigger difference than we've seen in the past between parties. So in terms of taxation, as an investor, Harris taxing companies more, Trump taxing companies less. Trump's going to give you more tax breaks. One of the things Trump seems to be most proud of was an amnesty he had, where he basically had a lower tax for bringing money back to the US from abroad. Brought in hundreds of billions. Because what's been happening is that American companies like Apple will basically have offices in Ireland where they'll do business and get taxed at that very low Irish rate. And they'll keep the money in Ireland because you brought that same money back to the US, they'll be taxed at a higher US rate. So they keep the money, don't get taxed, but they don't bring it back to the US. Trump gave them basically an incentive to do that by saying, bring it back to the US, your tax rate is significantly low. They brought the money back to the US. That was obviously a once-off effect, but it was a positive effect for Trump. Harris, I don't think, would be as amenable to those kind of things. Then we have foreign policy. Now, I know this is a bit of a simplification, but based on the rhetoric that we are getting from the different parties out there, it is pretty clear that Trump is less of a warmonger than Harris is. Just pretty clear. Trump does not seem to want to escalate the war with Ukraine. He wants to heighten tensions with China, but mostly on the trade front and less on the military front. Even in Israel, where he seems to be pro-Israeli, his vice president has come and said, Israel, support them, love them, they're great, but we are going to pursue our own policies, and our policies include no war with Iran. Okay? So it does seem very clear that Trump is going to be more pro no wars, let's say, or less pro-war than Harris regime is going to be. Harris comes into power, Ukraine basically continues to get supplies from the US, continuing that war. We may even see more tensions in against China because the Democrats are more likely to support Taiwan, which is the main contention between the US and China. The Taiwan government or the Taiwan system being separate from China is a huge area of contention for the Chinese. The Chinese have always been talking about the fact that they want to have Taiwan back into their fold. The Democrats have so far said much more in terms of support for China than the Republicans have. And then one more thing I want to put out there, which I have not put on this list, but I just want to put it out there. is regulation. Regulation, I think, is going to be a real big wild card here. Now, Trump, for whatever reason, has gotten much more anti-regulation and much more anti-bureaucracy in this term than he was in the previous term. Let's look at these three aspects of this. Firstly, Elon Musk, big supporter of Trump, very, very much against regulation. He has had huge issues with the FAA, the SEC, the judge down in Delaware that took away his $56 billion pay package. Lots and lots of issues with regulators. And he is by far the biggest donor in the current election in favor of Trump. He is doing rallies on behalf of Trump. He's attending rallies for Trump. He is paying people money to register to vote in these key states. He has a lottery where he's paying $1 million a day to somebody who signs a petition saying they support, free speech and the Second Amendment, which is right now code words for supporting the Republicans. Those things together gives him a lot of sway, and maybe the most sway of anyone out there. But I'll talk about another person, but also have this kind of sway in the election. And this is a more shadowy figure. Again, sounds very conspiratorial, but I'll explain the reason behind it. So Elon Musk, anti regulation. He wants to basically, comes out and talk about something called the Department of Government Efficiency. And he's talked about how you can cut $2 trillion of government spending in the US. But the Department of Government Efficiency spells DOGE, which happens to spell Doge, which is the same name as a cryptocurrency that Elon Musk also supports. So make of it what you will. But regulation, if Elon Musk gets his way, for things like the EPA, like the FAA, maybe the SEC, could be significantly reduced. The next factor is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr. Robert F. Kennedy is the son of Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the son of Robert F. Kennedy, who was the brother of JFK, okay? The guy that was assassinated. By the way, the brother was also assassinated. Both of them were assassinated. And that has given Robert F. Kennedy a bit of a conspiratorial kind of complex. I mean, if your uncle and your father, who are both basically big-time politicians, were assassinated, and there's whole movies out there about how the government did it, you're going to grow up not trusting the government as much. For those that don't know, there's a big conspiracy, and has been a big conspiracy for the last 60 years, that the CIA killed JFK and possibly his brother as well. That's a whole big conspiracy out there. I can imagine growing up where you were actually the son of one person and the nephew of the other. You can come out with a very conspiratorial attitude. He's also gotten involved in a lot of litigation against companies for health concerns. So why is he important? He was running for the presidency as well. And in fact, he was polling, in some cases, above 10%. Remember, this current difference between Trump and Harris is like 1 or 2%. And there was this guy who was getting 10% of the vote plus. But he jumps out to support Trump. So Trump basically owes him a big favor. Like he owes Musk a big favor. I mean, Musk is, like I said, giving millions of dollars a day away to Trump at the moment. And obviously Trump's going to appreciate that. But RFK as well, for supporting him, is giving, a lot of support to Trump. He said, vote for Trump, endorses him quite strongly, blah, blah, blah. And he's anti, like I said, regulation in two areas. Okay, food, is massively interventionist in two areas, food and drugs. He wants a lot more regulation around food and a lot less regulation around drugs. If you're watching his stuff, he comes out with stuff about how much more chemicals are allowed in food in the US versus in Europe. And this is a true thing. The US has a lot more leniency when it comes to chemicals like colorings and so on. I mean, a lot of the stuff they put in food in the US is like straight out of crude oil. Like it's straight from chemicals. It was never food. And they are banned in Europe, okay? And he blames the US's bad health on that. And he is much more in favor of legalization of a lot of, or reducing the burden on drugs. He's much more in favor of, the ability to do whatever, or use whatever drugs you want if you want to save your life, etc. And also, he's against vaccines. He's actually quite heavily against vaccines, blaming them even before COVID for things like autism, etc. in children. And so if he's going to play a big role, and he's quite possibly going to play a big role in the post-Trump presidency, if Trump does win, you would see a big shakeup in the Food and Drug Administration. And that would make an impact on the way drugs are priced and sold in the US, as well as food and price sold in the US. Now, this thing I didn't put down as a thing because I don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be, but that could be an issue. And the final thing I'll put out there as well is Trump has basically started to talk about, regulation in a much more negative way, taking much more of a tone from like Ronald Reagan in the past. And I think put all those things together, and you're going to see that a Trump presidency is going to come with a significant change in how the US government regulates air travel, regulates drugs, regulates industry, regulates space, regulates possibly even things like, for instance, food, as well as even, businesses. So regulation is going to be a big difference. The Harris regime will be the same. There'll be no big change in regulation if Harris wins. If Trump wins, we could see significant changes in the number of regulators, things out there. Crypto as well, by the way, a big deal. And, must mention the crypto brothers or bros, like the crypto bros, people that support crypto are much more in favor of Trump than they are of Harris. So, what to buy? This is what you guys came for. So here comes the thing to buy if Trump wins. Firstly, a company called Palantir. And this is the other shadowy figure I want to talk to you guys about in the Trump sphere. There's a guy called Peter Thiel. If you watch The Social Network, one of the guys that was, helped Mark Zuckerberg out was a guy called Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel basically is, strange enough, also has an African link. He's from Namibia. Elon Musk, as you know, is from South Africa. Is a big-time investor in the US. He has a company called Palantir that does a lot of business with the US government, and is focused on AI as well as, security and other kind of issues in the US and elsewhere in the world. And by the way, Palantir is one of the best performers in my AI portfolio. Done incredibly well for me over the last since I bought it. For those who don't know, I run an AI portfolio, and it's been basically done really well. If you guys are interested in that, give me a shout, and I'll discuss you in more detail. So Palantir. So why is Peter Thiel possibly up there as a rival, if not a bigger, influence on the Trump regime than anybody else? Well, he has not supported Trump as much this time around as he did the first time around. The first time around, he was pretty much the only billionaire that supported Trump. Now Trump has many billionaires, from Elon Musk to people like David Sachs to Bill Ackman, like Mark Andreessen. A lot of people have come out and supported Trump that did not support him in the past. But back in 2016, he was the Trump billionaire. But this time around is not. So why does he have so much power? Well, it's to do with Trump's VP, a guy called J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance was, if you ever watched a movie called Hillbilly Elegy, I think it stars Glenn Close and I think Emma Stone. I think it's a good movie. It's based on a book written by J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance grew up really poor, went to the military, went to I think Harvard or one of the or Yale or one of the Ivy League schools. Then got out and worked in Silicon Valley for a bit. And when he was in Silicon Valley, his mentor was Peter Thiel. And then Peter Thiel pumped something like $50 million into getting J.D. Vance elected to be a senator in the US. In fact, he had two people, a guy called Blake Masters and J.D. Vance. And Blake Masters didn't make it, but J.D. Vance did. Apparently before this, while he was in Silicon Valley, JD Vance was not super successful. He was successful. I mean, I'm not saying he was starving or anything, but he wasn't like, making the huge multi-billion-dollar bets that wins like, people like Mark Andreessen have made in the past, etc. So he had a pretty average career in Silicon Valley before being supported by Peter Thiel to become a senator, and now apparently also supported by Thiel to become Trump's VP. Given Trump's age, and given Trump's weight, which you can pretty much see from the way it goes, pictures, etc., there is at least about a 20% chance that Trump does not live to the end of his term. A male American of that age, that kind of body mass index, has a certain percentage chance of dying in the next 4 years, just from health-related issues. Okay, Trump has a big chance of dying in the next 4 years just from his health-related issues, just a tutorial thing. If Trump does die, Vance becomes the president. That's how it works. The president dies, the vice president becomes the president. And Peter Thiel has had a lot more to do with JD Vance becoming president, if he does become president, than almost anybody has to do with Trump becoming president if he does become president. And so Peter Thiel has a very strong link to the Trump regime. And so I would expect, Palantir would do well in that regime. Next, you would buy Bitcoin and possibly other cryptos as well. Because like I mentioned, Trump far more positive on crypto than Harris is. Harris has gotten a bit more, lenient on crypto, but she's not as pro-crypto as Trump is. So Trump wins, probably want to buy yourself some Bitcoin and maybe some other kinds of crypto that, might just do well. Next, Tesla. For obvious reasons, Musk is very pro-Trump. If you look at the amount of money that Tesla gets from government, grants, etc. I mean, one of the big sources of income with Tesla, it's what's called credits for, carbon credits, kind of things, where you do, get benefits from like reducing the amount of carbon out in the world. If you see Trump in office, I would expect that to continue. If you see Harris in office, Harris has really shown that she doesn't, or the Republicans have really shown that they're not about basically persecuting Musk's companies if they can. And so I would say that, Tesla probably would benefit from a Trump win. Next, merger targets. Why? Well, one of the big blocks to mergers in the US at the moment is someone called Lina Khan, appointed by the Democrats, a very young person, early 30, and in charge of this major division of the US government. That is very unusual. Most people don't get this kind of position until their 40s, and more often their 50s or 60s even. She's gotten it very young. She's blocked a lot of mergers. If we have a Trump regime, there's a big chance that she gets kicked out, somebody more amenable to mergers is put in, and then companies in the past, like a few years, that were basically denied the ability to be bought out by somebody else, suddenly can be bought out again, and would likely, when a company gets bought out, its share price goes ballistic. So you have to go look at all the companies that were denied mergers in the last, say, 2-3 years, and made a little portfolio of those companies. And if Trump won, I would suspect that portfolio would do reasonably well. And finally, Alphabet, also Google. Why? Because one of the things that Lina Khan is also looking to do is break up Google. Now, I don't know how much support Trump will have for Google. There's not put a question mark there. But I do know that Lina Khan definitely is trying to break up Google. That's part of the kind of strategy. Google, by the way, is the biggest supporter of the Democrats of any corporate out there. Google employees almost universally support the Democrats. YouTube has come out in possibly, shadow ban some Trump videos. Google has come out and basically, also kind of maybe bias some of the stories about Trump when you search for Trump. So you put those things together, and it's quite likely that Trump doesn't have a lot of affection for Alphabet. That being said, I think Alphabet probably has a better chance of surviving as a company in a Trump presidency than in a Harris presidency. So make of that what you will. What to buy if Harris wins? A couple things. Boeing for a couple of reasons. Not only because, like I mentioned, Harris is far more keen to support Taiwan and Ukraine militarily. And that's going to be in the form of sending them machinery or sending them weaponry, sorry. And a lot of the weaponry is going to be made by Boeing. So, and of course, Lockheed Martin as well. So those two companies are going to basically benefit from a Harris regime from that point of view. Boeing's going to benefit in another way. There's only two companies in the US really that have a serious chance of going to space and being like really big space, companies. Yes, there's also Blue Origin, but that's kind of like, kind of a also ran. Maybe in a couple years' time, you might have caught up. But right now it's Boeing and it's SpaceX. And you see contracts between Boeing and SpaceX, with NASA, etc., constantly. Now, Boeing has had a very bad patch. Firstly, there was a kind of tender to build a rocket ship to take astronauts to space. Both Boeing and SpaceX got part of the contract. Boeing got twice as much money from that contract than SpaceX did. SpaceX already has gotten the rocket made, has taken astronauts up and down to the space station. Boeing only recently got the ability to basically get its rocket up. And I say up and not down, because what happened was it took the people up into space and was deemed too unsafe to bring them down. And so he'd have to leave them at the space station and return alone. And in fact, those astronauts are going to be saved by Elon Musk's SpaceX. So SpaceX is going to have to go up and take those astronauts and bring them back down again. That has meant that Boeing has suffered a huge reputational damage in terms of its space business. And in all likelihood, in future deals, we would likely see Boeing, not get as much, love as SpaceX does from places like, NASA, etc. But that's in a fair world. If Harris wins, guess what? I don't think SpaceX is going to get as many contracts as it would otherwise. I think there'll be a huge incentive to give Boeing more support to try and get its space business up as a real competitor to SpaceX. And so I think Boeing would be a nice thing to buy. Lockheed Martin, like I talked about with the military, you can look at the number of other military producers out there, and I think they would also do reasonably well under a Harris regime. The next thing is EU exporters, companies that export, machinery, etc., cars or whatever it is to the US. I think they would also benefit quite nicely from a Harris regime, because Trump is not just looking at tariffs on China; he's looking at tariffs on anybody. And he's mentioned and he's threatened tariffs on Mexico and then tariffs on the French a number of times. And so I would think that EU exporters would probably be blessed a bit more easily in a Harris regime than they would in a Trump regime. And then finally, I put down China. Again, I don't know. China is like the question mark, because, in terms of investments, probably Trump is going to be worse for China than Harris is. In terms of a military conflict, I think Harris is going to be worse for China than Trump is. So maybe in the short term, you might see an uptick in China, but the long term, I would suspect a Harris regime would probably be, more negative for China than a Trump one would. Okay. And that's it. That's the seminar for this week. Any questions? Oh, by the way, let me just publish this particular poll so you guys can see who was won. And it's basically came down at the end to 55 to 45 for Trump. But it, 55-45 is not a huge, I think, advantage. That's not much different from a pretty fair, coin toss, 50-50, 55-45. The difference is rather limited, okay? And I think that kind of mimics what we're seeing in the US as well. So does anybody have any questions so far? Oh, okay, I have one here. If you think that the drug regulation is going to change, why are you not putting any drug companies down? Well, because it's more complicated than just regulations. It's also about, Medicaid. It's about, drug pricing. And so I think there's more, uncertainty about that than there would be, for instance, on just the pure, buy Boeing because it's going to be supported by the US regime, as opposed to, buy a drug company because they are more likely to make drugs. If you are going to look at drug companies in the event of a Trump win, I would look at the smaller drug companies. Why? For two reasons. Firstly, less regulation means it's cheaper for a company to get its drug approved, and the small companies benefit from that. The second thing is, one of the aims of a small company in the drug sector is to be bought out. I think that should that happen, what we would see is, because of the leader count thing, it's more likely to happen that you can get a buyout approved under a Trump regime than under a Biden regime. So if you are going to look at drugs, smaller drug companies, not the Eli Lilly's, you look at the tinier drug companies out there. Maybe Vivek Ramaswamy's company might be something to look at as well. It's about a $10 billion company, I believe. Boeing has put space business up for sale. Thoughts on the price and looking capital is considering military and commercial flight. Firstly, the Chinese can't get commercial flight right. There's only two companies in the world that can do commercial flight, really, and that's Boeing and that's Airbus. The commercial flight business cannot be let to die by the Americans. In fact, none of the parts of the thing, maybe except the space business, would be let to die by any regime, either Trump or by Harris. Militarily, the US cannot afford to have the Boeing military, machinery, go out. They have to have it exist. It's key to the US security and safety, and neither Trump nor Harris is going to let that happen. The space business, on the other hand, I think only gets supported by Harris and not by Trump. The Boeing situation is a little complicated in that they're currently in a strike action with the machinists, and they basically are short on cash to run that business. So they're going to have to do a capital raise. That means they're going to have to sell some of the shares at a really cheap price. If you're investing in Boeing, I would wait until that capital raise is done before you want to buy in. The next thing is that I think that the space business, for whatever reason, cannot compete with Musk. In fact, none of the space businesses anywhere in the world can compete with Musk. Say what you want about Elon Musk. That man is able to do certain things that nobody else can do. Recently, I saw an interview with Jensen Huang, the guy that runs NVIDIA, and he talked about the supercomputer that Elon Musk had built in Louisiana, which is the most powerful supercomputer in the world. He says any other company would take a year to plan and a year to build that thing. How long, I should have had this as a thing, how long do you think it took Musk to build something that Jensen Huang says will take at least 2 years for any other company to build? 19 days, less than 3 weeks. What would take other companies 2+ years to build, he did in 3 weeks. For whatever reason, he just seems to be able to execute in a way that's unbelievable. And in space, I don't think the Boeing business can compete without being supported dramatically by the government. I don't think that Blue Origin is up to scratch versus Musk. And I don't know why that is, because but all the advantages Musk has, Jeff Bezos has more. Okay, Jeff Bezos has more flexible money than Musk does, because Amazon makes more money than Tesla does. Amazon does not depend as much on Jeff Bezos existing than Tesla does on Amazon, on Musk existing. That means Musk can't get out of Tesla, but Jeff Bezos has left Amazon. Jeff Bezos can sell his Amazon shares and without causing the market to get shocked. So all those things together makes you believe that Jeff Bezos basically should be able to compete with Musk, but he can't. So for whatever reason, I think that space business just can't compete with SpaceX. For what, I don't know why, but like I said, Musk has some ability to do things that other people just can't do. Next, how will energy companies be affected by Trump or Harris wins? I think the Trump win is going to be more positive for fracking companies in the US, more positive for oil production in the US. It would be negative for oil prices because it's going to drop the price of oil because the US will produce more, and therefore it's going to be something where you would see, for instance, global energy prices probably coming down, especially if you consider the fact as well that Trump is much more likely to have the war with Ukraine end. between Ukraine and Russia ending. If that happens, and he lets Russia back into the global, oil markets, plus US producing more oil, we would see energy prices come down. Harris, on the other hand, is not as likely to reduce the tensions in Ukraine, and therefore you would see Russian oil off the system indefinitely into the future. Even if Ukraine loses, Russian oil is still going to be off the system, whereas with Trump, there's a chance it comes back on. But regarding her energy policy, the weird thing what Harris actually have not mentioned is that she ran for the presidency back in 2019, and now she's running for it in 2024. The problem is that she has, EJ, thanks for the compliment. So she has made statements about, energy that back in 2019, 4 years ago, that she's not making right now, which leads you to believe that our energy policy is more unknown than she's saying. She's likely or possibly going to ban fracking in the US, higher oil prices, because US production will be reduced. The way fracking works, by the way, is that those wells don't last as long. You're going to have continual approvals to put more wells in to keep the production up, because those wells kind of dry out quicker. And with her basically anti-Russia stance, more likely Russian oil stays off the market for longer. So I would suspect that you'd see oil prices higher in a Harris regime. Okay. Will AGOA be affected if Trump wins? Quite possibly. That being said, here's the unfortunate fact of the matter. Africa is such a small part of the US trade that it would quite possibly escape his notice. He may just do it just to punish Africa for whatever reason. He does seem to have a particular antipathy towards South Africa. He's made some pretty bad statements about South Africa. And so he decided to just punish South Africa and Africa for, for that. But in reality, it's such a small part of their trade that it could quite possibly escape the notice. It quite possibly be something that just on the back burner. That's just a goer. Any businesses on the JSE that will win or lose from a US election outcome? I would suspect there is a theory out there that the last month's market moves have been the market thinking that Trump's going to win. So whatever the moves you've seen in the JSE for the last month or so, international companies, I would think that those moves might continue going forward. I would think probably with both Trump and Harris, there's going to be massive government deficits, $10 trillion pass. So you might want to be looking at gold or miners, because when you have that kind of spending, eventually inflation is going to be affected by it. And so I would think that you would want to basically have a look at some of the safe haven stuff if Trump wins. I would suspect, however, that the one company you probably don't want to be too closely involved in would be Tencent in the event of a Harris win. Why? Because if Harris does, go to war with Taiwan, you would see the kind of stuff that happened in Russia happening to China. And the US and South Africa, even though we may have not as great relationship we could have, the South African financial system is much more closely tied to the US financial system than it is to the Chinese financial system. And if we do have a war between the Chinese and the Americans, you don't want to be owning Chinese assets. Okay. Question here, I came in late. Is the recording available? It will be on YouTube, I think, in the next day or so. How will the US dollar be affected by a Trump or Harris win? This is another thing. If this thing is sorted out and we do have a Trump or Harris win, and it's clear and it's none of that, hanging chad nonsense, the dollar will slowly strengthen. Longer term, I think Trump is more likely to pressure Powell or whoever the head of the Reserve Bank is in the US to be cutting interest rates, because he's more willing to do that, and that might be weaker for the dollar. But I think in the short term, if we can get an election result out, the dollar should strengthen. Okay. And that's it. Anyone else? Okay, thank you, guys. Like I said, the final results was 55-40 for Trump, 45 for Harris. So it seems that there's more Trump supporters than Harris, but it's close enough. Probably with our small sample size within the margin of error. And I look forward to speaking to you guys again at the next seminar we will have. I think that's in December, where we'll be talking about my AI portfolio. Okay, cheers, guys.